Well, Alan, I'm really excited for you to join me today. I know you've been in my Facebook group for a while, and me and you have conversed back and forth for so many months. It feels like I know you, having never met you. So, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
And tell us a little bit about what you do. I know you've got Better Protectors. I know you have a full-time job. I know that you're security director at your church. There's so many things that you do. So, start off by telling us a little bit about Alan Hughes.
So my first career was in law enforcement. After I retired from law enforcement, I kind of got into human resources. And along the way, I returned to church. Now, I grew up in the church, and then I was away from it for probably 25 years. I like to refer to that time as the time I was working on my testimony. And so I came back, and as I came back into the church, I found that there was this whole field of church safety that I knew nothing about. But because of my law enforcement background, they asked me to start getting involved. And so I did. And it was probably about, I want to say 6 months or so into it. I ended up being asked to take over the program there. And I will say that it's been a transformation all along. If you talked to me back then, 11 years ago, to today, there's a lot of things that have changed differently in me. I went into it with that law enforcement mentality and that law enforcement demeanor. And gradually, it has just transformed into what I like to think of as a more mature approach and a more spiritually mature approach.
So, I like what you said as well. It's for culture as well, Alan, isn't it? I like what you said there. That really is. And I think it's one of the first things I say in my book is you've got to understand the church culture before you can really help them.
Yeah, I agree. And so, I eventually went into being the security director for a large multi-campus church. Then I became their human resources director for a time as well, because I had that perfect storm of safety and human resources, and they needed both. And then in January of 2022, my partner and I launched our training company, Better Protectors, and I left full-time ministry at that point. I still serve in church safety, and we still do a lot of training for churches, but I'm not working in that now as my full-time job. Instead, we're doing the training, and I also have a job as a writer. So.
Well, thank you. I know we don't necessarily have to go into your faith journey in this podcast, but I'm interested in 25 years away from the church. What was your biggest maybe transformation or revelation that brought you back? And you don't need to go into too much detail because we're talking about church security, but it's interesting to get a bit about who you are as a man as well.
So I have a tattoo of Luke 15:20 on my arm, and Luke 15:20 describes the answer to your question. So that's in the parable of the prodigal son, and that's the verse where the father was looking off into the distance, saw the son, ran to him, embraced him, and welcomed him back in. Well, that was my dad and I. So all during that 25 years, my dad never stopped believing that I would come back to the church. And he would invite me, and he would invite me. And, I've always had an excuse. And so finally one day he was like, just come one time. If you come one time, I'll never ask you again. And so that weekend I did kind of roll in there, and just like in the parable, my dad was looking in the parking lot. He was still believing that I would show up. He saw me before I got out of my car. He was waiting at the door to welcome me, and bring me over to a seat. And true to his word, he never asked me again. I just kept coming back on my own. So that's kind of the quick version of how that happened.
Well, and that is a bold statement for a Christian to make. Come one time, and then you don't have to come again. So I'm glad that Lord bless you, and that's pleasing for me to hear, because I'm a man that grew up without a father. So anytime that I hear the call of a father, it always opens my heart. So thank you for sharing that, Alan. And I know one of your loves is really about protecting people, and obviously with your company called Better Protectors, I'm really grateful that the Lord has given you all the skills that He's given you to now help and serve people. And like you say, you do a lot of secular work as well. But one thing I wanted to focus our conversation on today, Alan, was about Stop the Bleed, which is quite new, right? I mean, it's not new for us that have been in around safety and security for a while, and particularly around medical response, but it's quite a new concept for some people. So where did your interest in Stop the Bleed come from?
It was really a natural extension of protecting people. I've been a CPR, first aid, AED instructor for a lot of years. And this was just a natural extension of it. Initially, I took a course because, it was available. And I started to see the not just, yes, this is useful, but how much useful it was on a broader context. I know a lot of times when people talk about Stop the Bleed, they're thinking about active shooter events and gunshots and things like that. And really, it is so much broader than that. I think the statistic is about 20% of people that die from traumatic injuries could have been saved by having their bleeding controlled. So it's one of the leading causes of preventable deaths. And so when I talk to people about, whether they should have Stop the Bleed training at their church or at their workplace or their community group, I tell them, you are so much more likely to use this than the active shooter training. This is around your house when somebody falls off of a ladder and their femur comes through their leg and severs their femoral artery. They've got about 2.5 minutes to live at that point. So we have to know what to do, and we have to be able to do it quickly. It's the crash that happens in front of you on your way home from work. Statistically, somewhere around 80% of American adults will be in a car crash in their lifetime. There's a good chance that somebody's going to be bleeding in that. I even read a story a few months ago about a guy that was putting a dish in the sink, and it slipped, it broke, bounced up, and ended up cutting him across the arm to the point of where he had to self-apply a tourniquet.
Wow.
Which makes me believe that I should not clean up the dishes.
Exactly. But go to Home Depot and buy a dishwasher. A dishwasher. So, Alice, I guess so. Let's take it back a step then. Mm-hmm. So, I always like to try and make sure that my listeners really comprehend. Mm-hmm. So the difference then, so someone could be saying, well, Simon, I've done CPR training. Mm-hmm. Alan's talking about Stop the Bleed. How does that apply to me? What is the difference between someone saying, well, I've done CPR, I've got this sorted, to you saying, well, no, Stop the Bleed is a different course? What's the difference between some basic life safety and Stop the Bleed?
Well, again, you're looking at all kinds of different emergencies that need to happen. And for years we learned the ABCs, right? Airway, breathing, circulation. That was the thing, right?
In England, we used to say Dr. ABC, danger response, airways, breathing, circulation. There you go.
Okay. But now, we realize that it's the bleeding first, the massive hemorrhaging, because, the whole purpose of CPR is to circulate the blood, to circulate oxygen-rich blood through the body, keep the brain alive. You can go 10 minutes without oxygen to the brain. You can bleed out in 2.5 minutes. So we need to address that first. And that is different. In regular first aid classes, they'll teach you, pressure, elevate the wound, things like that. There are simply wounds that will not work on. where we need to talk about tourniquets, we need to talk about wound packing, we need to talk about chest seals. And those are the things that that a Stop the Bleed course addresses more thoroughly and more pointedly than in a general first aid course.
And I can't remember the guy's name because it just suddenly come to me, but in the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013, there's a horrendous picture that you can see online. And I think he was a 21-year-old. I know he was a 21-year-old Costco worker, and they actually made a movie about him.
Yeah.
I just can't remember what his name is. And the bomb had actually taken off. I think he was from the kneecap down. His legs are just gone, and someone had applied a tourniquet then. And, he actually says that without that, that saved his life. And I think it could have just been a belt at first. Someone didn't have a true tourniquet. It just took their belt off, applied it around his wound and kept him alive so he didn't bleed out.
Yeah, and I will say that that's probably more miraculous than it sounds, because improvised tourniquets rarely work. They have a very poor track record. They are better than nothing, and I'm not saying that they can't work. They just have a much lower success rate than using a proper tourniquet. So yes, it can be improvised, but that many improvised tourniquets, that was a little more miraculous than it sounded.
There was God in there as well. Yeah. For sure there was, because the other miraculous thing, and I don't know why his name eludes me because I do training on this as well, but what was more miraculous is that he was the guy that actually saw the two Boston Marathon bombers, and he saw them with the heavy backpack. He saw them keep putting it down. They had no interest in the race. They were turning around. They were dressed different than everyone else. He saw all the indicators. And his regret is a great 60-minute video on this, on 60 Minutes on YouTube, where he said, if only I'd gone to one of the police officers and said, this is what I've seen, would the day have been any different? And that's, like I said, he was 21 years old, Costco worker. That was a lot on his conscience to say, if only I'd walked over and said, I see these behavior indicators, just letting you know, officer, would things have been different? So I think that's why there was a miraculous miracle for him to tell that tale, because you can't get a stronger stance on why you should not ignore your instincts as to listen to that poor guy. But anyway, we're digressing into like behavior indicators now, which mean you could talk about all day, but
yes,
we're going to talk about Stop the Bleed. Yeah. So I mean, like, as an example, having a belt is okay, but it's not, favored. That's mostly going to be the exception rather than rule. What would you say in today's world, the year that we live in? It's a crazy world out there. What should people have in their car? In a woman in their purse? What should we be carrying with us in today's world to be ready?
Well, at a minimum, we're talking about tourniquets, but tourniquets are only part of the answer in terms of Stop the Bleed. So you have three different pieces of equipment in that Stop the Bleed arsenal: tourniquets, wound packing material, and chest seals, because they're all for different parts of the body. Tourniquets only work on the limbs. So if the wound is in the chest, the tourniquet does nothing for you. If the wound is in the leg, the tourniquet is the great answer for you. If it's in a junctional area, like in the shoulder junction, in the pelvis, things like that, then you're doing wound packing with wound packing material. And then if it's anywhere in what we call the box, so basically from the shoulder blades to the waist, that torso area, that's going to be chest seals. So having all three of those in a easy to grab, one grab it and go thing is the ideal. That's not very realistic for a lot of people. Now I carry an ankle medical kit that goes on the ankle, and it has wound packing material. It has a tourniquet. It has chest seals, and also some small shears and things like that. Not everybody's going to do that, and I get that. So at the minimum, I at least ask people carry a tourniquet. Carry a tourniquet, even if you aren't even trained with it. Start carrying a tourniquet today so that if you are somewhere and someone who does know how to use it doesn't have one, you can give it to them. Or if they need a second one.
Well, yeah, or maybe even a third one, who knows?
Yeah.
But and I think when we look at this, for people listening to this podcast, if you go back 10, 15, maybe probably 20 years, the thought of carrying these things, actually maybe it could even be 7 or 8 years, the thought of carrying these things was definitely not at the forefront of people's mind. But I mean, as where we are now, I mean, for me, living in Minneapolis, Minnesota, I mean, I have to turn the news off. My two sons, 9 and 12, can't really watch the news because every day here someone's being shot. There's some type of stray bullet going in a house. I mean, watching the news is just depressing, but it does tell you the stark reality of the world that we live in. And carrying the things that you're talking about, Alan, is becoming more prominent because we're seeing these things more and more, whether we like to believe it or not. You turn on the news and this is happening in every city across the US.
Well, and even medically speaking, so 20 years ago, 25 years ago, the general consensus was tourniquets were a last resort. If you put a tourniquet, the conventional wisdom was if you put a tourniquet on, they're going to lose that limb. So this should be the very last thing that you do. And that was just misguided. That was a set of facts that really came about during the Civil War, where pretty much you lost a limb no matter what anyway, if you were wounded. And they weren't getting treatment for days and days after putting that tourniquet on. So they were losing it for gangrene and other infections and things like that, where we learned a lot in the war in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And we have learned the importance of early, almost immediate intervention with tourniquets and how important they can be, even to the point of self-aid, where you're applying it to your own limb to, so that the rest of the unit can carry on. And honestly, you can carry on with a tourniquet to a degree. You can still move around. I've put a tourniquet on and then continued teaching just so that people could see that you can still function. Of course, you're seeking more advanced aid at that point, but you're not just out of it at that point just because there's a tourniquet on.
And I know my friend, Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman, he offers numbers. He actually says that tourniquets are one of the reasons why the murder rate in the US has gone down, because people are doing such a good job of keeping people alive. So I mean, he takes the stats to a different level and says tourniquets are reducing the murder rate because 5, 6, 10 years ago these people would have been dying, but now we're slapping tourniquets on people and they're surviving these gun wounds. So it's interesting.
The same in our military. The advances not just in tourniquets but chest seals, wound packing, the immediacy of care that can be obtained has dramatically dropped the death rate in combat.
Yeah.
And so we're simply taking what we've learned in those environments and we're applying it to the to the civilian environment.
Yeah, and I want to cover something for a moment. So you mentioned the tourniquet and sort of packing the wound. I mean, should someone find themselves in a situation where they don't have some of these things? I know there's a lot of kits out there, and I think when this podcast release, I don't know if you sell this stuff, Alan, or if you can recommend someone, but we'll put some links where people can buy this stuff. But in relation to packing the wound, what's some advice you'd give, Alan, if someone finds himself in a situation of everybody thinking, again, this is never going to happen to me, but it's happening to people every day in the US. So we want to make sure they're listening. But what advice would you give about packing the wound?
Obviously, the first piece of advice is get training. Get somebody to actually show it to you. There are some good videos available that you can find on wound packing. I will tell you this, it is not pretty. It is it's yucky and sticky, and you are literally putting your fingers down into the wound to find the source of the bleeding and shoving the gauze in there as tightly as you can to compress an artery against a bone. So it is not pretty. It is not something where you're going to put that tourniquet on, crank it down, and okay, you're done. It's going to take you a minute, and it's going to be an experience you will never forget doing.
Yeah, I like that you said that, because it's reminded me when I was a young police officer back in England. I think the Stop the Bleed gives you the reality of how difficult the situation is. And I was a young police officer. I think I was 20 years old, where I was driving down the road and I saw a person on a bicycle and he fell to the floor, and I sort of saw it in my rearview mirror. I sort of turned around and the gentleman had had a heart attack, and I was probably 6 months out of the police academy in England. And then straight away I was and this was in 1999, this most probably was, Alan, and it was doing mouth to mouth without a mouth guard on someone real life wasn't what I did in police training. And sorry if you're having your coffee or eating, listen to this. I was spitting the mucus out of my mouth to apply my lips again to do the breath. And it was one of the most horrible things I've ever had to do. And I've seen some bad things in the police. So I think the training that prepares you for that, and that wasn't, I mean, we were doing the Recess Annie, and it was such a controlled environment we were doing in training, to then do it in real life. I was trained, but I wasn't prepared. And I think that's what the Stop the Bleed will give you. It'll train you, but also prepare you for the reality of what the situation is, because it's not nice, Alan, is it?
No, it's not. And, I've said this before, over the course of my time in the military and my time in law enforcement, I've seen a lot of violent things. I've seen a lot of pretty ugly things. I was a traffic homicide investigator, so I've seen some pretty gruesome scenes. But if there is one thing that will wake me up in the middle of the night, it was that time that I tried to do CPR on an infant and was unsuccessful.
Yeah.
And I try to talk about that in classes to understand ahead of time that it won't always work. They won't always come back. CPR won't always work. The tourniquet won't always work. You just have to understand that going into it. And to me, being able to, at the end of the day, look in the mirror and go, I did the best I could with the skills that I had, with what God gave me, and the rest of it was in his hands.
Yeah, that is. Yeah.
And kind of let yourself off the hook.
Yeah, you do. And on that story that I gave, I mean, the guy survived. I went to visit him in hospital, and he said, Officer Osimo said, I'm a strong old man. It would take more than that to kill me. And I said, well, at least I'm grateful that I was there and could help you. And I went back to hospital a couple of days later to find out where it was, and it had another heart attack and died.
Oh,
so the law took him home, but it wasn't always that case. I think it was most probably 6 months later or a year later, Alan, I was first on scene. Was an attempted murder that turned into a murder, and the woman died in my arms. And again, similar to you, that is not, I was most probably 21, I think, when that happened. A woman that you don't know dying in your arms. I mean, that was also an experience as well. After doing what you can to keep her alive. I mean, those are memories that stick with you for forever. So I think we've really drummed. People are thinking, "Oh, Simon Allen, you get us all depressed now." It's like, we're trying to stress the importance of medical, because when we work with churches, Alan, everyone wants to go to the sexy stuff. It's firearms,
right?
It's combative training. But you and I know that the likelihood is you're going to be applying, a Band-Aid to someone, or someone's fainted and stuff. So medical for me is outside of conflict de-escalation. It's in your top two, depending how you want to say conflict de-escalation and medical. Really, that's really where we need to spend our time, right?
Yeah, I have never used my 9mm inside of a church. I have used a AED inside of a church. So there's that. And yes, it can sound depressing sometimes, but in the end, it's encouraging. it's encouraging because we know so much more than we knew 25 years ago. We know so much more than we knew 10 years ago. And it's not hard. And I have never had a student in a Stop the Bleed class that in 2 hours was not able to apply a tourniquet to themselves one-handed in under 30 seconds.
Yeah.
From people that had never touched a tourniquet ever in their life, they could apply a tourniquet and save their own life in 30 seconds. And that's what I tell people is sometimes it's not even about saving that random stranger. You know, if you're afraid of liability, you're afraid of blood, you're afraid of disease, whatever that is, that's your decision. But how about save yourself? How about save your family, people that you love, people that you are supposed to be protecting? And this is such an easy way to learn those skills and be ready to counteract what is such a common cause of death, which is just massive uncontrolled bleeding.
Yeah, and the woman that I talked about, having a woman die in your arms is not a pleasant experience as a police officer. But I can remember that there was a couple of young guys there that could have been 18, 19. I mean, I was a young police officer anyway, and they were just a little bit younger than me. And they said, what is it you need us to do? And it was before you even had these pack wounds, I was like, you just got to get your hands over there and just pack this wound. And I can't remember where it is in scripture, but the verse that says, send me, I mean, they stood up and said, tell us what it is that you need to do. But these courses are so realistic and there's so much out there to try and simulate that stress. They're really great. So, Alan, I know you're down in Florida and you teach this, and Stop the Bleed isn't necessarily something where someone can say, hey, Alan, fly into LA and do this, but where can people find?
We'll travel.
You will travel. Yeah.
We'll go anywhere.
Yeah.
Typically there are people in every area that are able to teach it. So we're probably not your most economical bet, but we go anywhere to teach that, and we love to teach it.
And so where should they go? Is it like stopthebleed.com or .org?
So actually the Stop the Bleed is a trademark, and it's owned by the Department of Defense. They're the ones that oversee this program, and so they also have what is called the Commission or the Committee for Tactical Emergency Care, and they have on their website, I'll give you the link to it. They have a list of people that are approved educational providers. I would say be careful. If they're on that list, then they are vetted. There are a lot of people that will tell you we can teach Stop the Bleed because they took a class, or they took an extra hour module at the Red Cross or something like that, and it's not quite the same. So I would say be careful. Get an instructor that is vetted. There's only a handful of organizations that can actually certify instructors in the first place. So I would say looking at the link that I'll send you is a good place to start.
Yeah. And I think I'd like to end, Alan, just talking a little bit about the mindset. There could be a few doubting Thomases that say, well, if I get involved here and something goes wrong, am I going to be held liable? And no, each state here in the US is like its mini country, and there's different sort of Good Samaritan laws and stuff. But I mean, what would you say to someone if they're hesitant, thinking, well, if something goes wrong, am I going to be held accountable? I mean, obviously, they need to step into this because it keeps people alive. But what would you say to people that could be apprehensive, wondering if something goes wrong, what's going to happen to me?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, it's sad that we have to question whether it's okay to do the right thing. But that is the environment that we're in. Almost, as to my knowledge, all 50 states have some form of a Good Samaritan law. But in general, you're looking at the reasonable standard, is the reasonable man standard is what they're looking at. If you're doing it as voluntarily, so you're not a doctor, you're not a nurse, you're not doing it as a profession. If you are voluntarily trying to help someone in an emergency and you're acting in good faith and you don't exceed the standards that you've been trained to or exceed what a reasonable person would do, you will be generally covered from lawsuits. So when we talk about exceeding the scope of your training or exceeding what would be reasonable, just because you've seen on TV somebody cut a hole in somebody's throat and put a straw in there, no, that'll probably get you sued. And as your instructor, I'm not going to come there and help you out in court. But trying to apply a tourniquet, trying to stop the bleeding, things like that, even CPR, where you might get ribs dislocated or broken or things like that. I can't think of a case that I have seen in the past 10 years where the Good Samaritan law did not cover somebody who was acting reasonably within the scope of their training.
Yeah, when people are going into it with the right intentions, aren't they? So, well, Alan, I mean, like I said, me and you have mostly conversed back and forth. It could be at least a couple of years within various different Facebook groups. It's been great to actually spend some time with you, get to know you a little bit more and share some of your wisdom around medicals and stop the bleed. So thank you for joining me.
So if there's one thing that I could kind of throw in there before we part is please don't get caught with fake tourniquets. There are so many tourniquets out there that if you go onto Amazon or something like that and it looks like one of the approved tourniquets, it seems like it, and it's much cheaper than some of the brand ones that we're talking about. I would caution you, please do not fall for that. It is not worth it. They're unproven designs. The materials, the Velcro, the materials that are actually doing the constricting, they have different standards in China and things like that. This is a piece of life-saving equipment. If you want to buy a knockoff Louis Vuitton bag, awesome. Don't buy a knockoff tourniquet. It's $25 to $30. It's a piece of life-saving equipment. This isn't the place that you save pennies.